Hi everyone. So today's lecture video is going to be about attitudes in the workplace. To give you an idea of how this connects to everything in the course, here is that figure that I showed a while back where you can see the connections that are being made here. So job attitudes, I'll circle it here, hopefully will let me, are present right about here. So job attitudes reflect, how we feel about where we work and the work that we do. And to give you an idea of how it fits into the understanding of some of the things we've talked about in this second half of the semester, in terms of talking about performance, which we see right here in the middle, I mentioned in the motivation section that there are three things that can influence performance: motivation, which we just talked about, individual differences, and the resources that people have to do that. Attitudes didn't quite make it into that three-legged stool model that I presented. And it's really hard to fit into this. If anything, it's either you could argue that it's under motivation or you could argue that it's under individual differences. But for the sake of this illustration, let's just note that attitudes are also something that can impact your performance. The way you feel about your organization and the way you feel about your job will lead you to perform your work in different ways and lead you to engage in different behaviors at work. Now, before we talk about attitudes, though, we have to understand perception. The reason for this is that our attitudes are based on our perception. So they are based on how we perceive things. But perception is not perfect. We've talked about this in performance management and performance appraisal, that our perceptions are influenced by biased processing, by schemas, by stereotypes, and all these other things that we mentioned before. So in that way, when we're thinking about attitudes, what we really need to understand is that it is based on perception, and therefore it is to some extent subjective. Okay. So here you see a screenshot of a classic study about perception, and it's called They Saw a Game. Now, what this study looked at was how two different teams, or rather their supporters, so their fans, these are sports teams of two colleges, saw the same game being played between the two football teams very differently. And I won't go into the nuts and bolts of it, but it's basically about how fans of Dartmouth College and fans of Princeton University both watched the same football game. And when they were asked to describe what happened in the game and how the other team behaved and how the other team acted, it became very clear that what people paid attention to varied based on the side of the field that they were on, or rather, and I don't mean that literally, I mean that figuratively. If you were a Dartmouth fan, for example, you were more likely to pay attention to the dirty moves that the Princeton team engaged in order to do well in the game. And so, in that way, what the authors of this paper argued is that these two groups of people effectively saw a different game, in the sense not that they, were observers to two different things, but that when you are perceiving things, it is very much influenced by your biases, by your pre-existing beliefs, which we've talked about before. And so in that way, we could look at the same event that happened objectively. So the same game happened. There's an objective way that the game happened, but we saw a different game. I perceived the game differently. So what this means is that people will have different attitudes in organizations, even if they work for the same organization and the same people, and they theoretically experience the exact same things. Perception is biased, and therefore attitudes are going to be subjective and influenced by a lot of factors beyond what goes on in an organization. So let's then talk about what job attitudes are. Attitudes very generally are a psychological tendency that is expressed by evaluating a particular entity with some degree of favor or disfavor. Now, these can be judgment, these can be based on or include judgments, memories of interacting with something, or both. So there are cognitive components to this. It's not, though, just a belief or even your emotions about the thing. Your judgments can be based on your beliefs and your attitudes can be based on your beliefs and your emotions, but it's much more complicated than that. Because attitudes consist of, or rather, can be described using something known as the tripartite model. What that means is that there are three components to or that influence an attitude. These are the cognitive component, the affective component, and the behavioral component. The cognitive component refers to thoughts that you have, beliefs that you have. So, for example, if you're thinking about this class, you may know that this class meets early in the morning. That is a piece of knowledge or a belief that you have about this class. Then there is the affective component. This is the emotional component. You may know that during this class, you are generally in a mildly positive mood, that this class generally you enjoy partaking in. And then there's the behavioral component of an attitude. These are the behaviors or the behavioral intentions that we have about the object. So for this class, you may have done every quiz and performed well. You may have shown up to every class, or you intend on doing well in every class, or you intend on showing up in every class. So in that way, your attitude towards this class is based on your cognitions or your beliefs, your emotions regarding the class, and your behaviors or your behavioral intentions toward the class. Now, what this notes is, this model does suggest that your behaviors are impacted by your emotions and your thoughts. So that's nothing new. But one thing that I want to note is like social psychologists think of this a little bit differently. So some people, especially in the organizational sciences, may say that an attitude consists of these things. What social psychologists would say, on the other hand, is that an attitude is an evaluation based on these different pieces of information. So your attitude is determined or influenced by your thoughts, by your emotions, and by your behaviors regarding the thing that you have an attitude toward, not, made up of that thing. So really quickly, here is where I will note and make a plea, especially for our in-class activities and the quizzes, that an attitude also, therefore, is not the way we talk about it colloquially or how we talk about it in our everyday speech. So in American English, we often say things like someone has a bad attitude, or if you didn't have such a bad attitude, then you would do so much better at work, or any number of things like that. A bad attitude, when people are referring to it colloquially, so how we talk about it in our everyday speech, is not how we talk about it as psychologists. As is noted before, an attitude is an evaluative statement or feeling or perception of a thing. A bad attitude, in terms of how we describe people, or in general, not psychologists, but people in our society describe people who have a bad attitude, usually refers to something like they have poor motivation and or negative emotions. So I just want to reiterate here that that's not what an attitude is. When we talk about someone has an attitude or she's got quite an attitude, usually we're talking about someone who's bossy or difficult or hard to be around, or someone who is generally dissatisfied. That's not what an attitude is here in this class, and it's not how we think about attitudes in psychology. So I just want to make that very, 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 very clear. So why should you care? Why should you care about the attitudes of people in the workplace? Why are we even studying these perceptions that people have? Well, attitudes impact behaviors, and this is something that we see from the textbook. It's in the first couple of pages of the chapter you're reading this week, where the theory of planned behavior shows that our behaviors are influenced by a number of things, but attitudes figure prominently in those influences. So your attitudes, right here, impact your intentions. So we should distinguish, when we're talking about intentions and behaviors, that intentions are when you plan on doing something, when you think about doing something, when you want to do something. Intentions have a strong impact on behavior, but it's not a perfect correlation. I may plan on working out tonight, as I do every evening, but I may not do it. I may find myself exhausted because it's a Friday evening, or I may find myself sick later or distracted by work or doing chores took too long. So there are a number of things that can influence our actual engagement in the behavior itself that aren't really captured here, but intentions can lead to behavior, but they don't always. But your attitudes do impact your intentions, your intent, your desire to do a certain behavior. So in the workplace, your job satisfaction, which we will talk about in a little bit, will influence your intentions to say, do your tasks, to do your job, to engage in citizenship behaviors. And those intentions will then influence your behavior. For the record, intentions aren't just influenced by attitudes, they are also influenced by subjective norms, which refer to social pressures to engage in a certain behavior, and then perceived behavioral control. So the extent to which you believe it will be easy or difficult to perform the particular behavior. And this does, of course, relate to some of the things that we talked about with expectancy theory in the previous module on motivation. But do attitudes actually predict behaviors? This is something that the social psychologists have often been studying and trying to assess, are people's behavior or attitudes actually impacting observable behaviors? So early research suggested maybe not. There was a study done many decades ago that looked at the time it was in hospitality, so it was many decades ago, I think in the 30s or 40s. So imagine that time period, and there was a lot more explicitly expressed racist attitudes during that time. So people were more willing to express negative attitudes, and I emphasize more, so it's relative, more willing to express racist attitudes openly. So in this study, what they looked at was they looked at attitudes towards Asian individuals. I believe it was Chinese individuals in particular. And they looked then at how the attitudes of hospitality workers impacted their interactions with Asian individuals, Asian patrons. And they actually found that there wasn't a strong connection between people's attitudes towards Chinese individuals and their behaviors toward them. There were a number of explanations. And for the record, they expected that these negative attitudes would lead to negative behaviors, but they found no, people were still generally friendly to these Chinese individuals. Like I said, it's definitely Asian. I believe it was specifically Chinese individuals. Now, there were multiple explanations for this. One was social desirability. At the time, it was considered normative, if not appropriate, to express anti-Asian sentiment. And in a way that we just probably, generally speaking, would not do now. So there were pressures to, in other words, there were pressures to be racist. So people were saying, oh yeah, I definitely don't like Chinese people. And what they found is, and so they believed then that these people were just saying that they had these negative attitudes, when in reality, maybe they didn't. Contrast that with what goes on today, where it's effectively the opposite. People still harbor racist ideas, but there's more of a pressure that you shouldn't communicate or express those. Another issue is potentially bad measurement, and I won't get into that necessarily. Well, we'll get into that in a second, actually. And the other variables are obviously, the social context. So the context in which we operate can influence the extent to which our attitudes impact our behaviors. So here you might be saying, well, yeah, of course, their anti-Asian attitudes did not manifest in their behaviors because they're at their work and they're in hospitality. If they are rude to patrons, they don't get money. And so there are multiple explanations for why attitudes didn't actually impact behaviors in this study. So people have been continuing to try to understand, well, when can we predict behaviors from attitudes? One way that we can do this is by predicting a bunch of behaviors. So we try to look at a bunch of different behaviors as opposed to just one. So in the previous study, they usually looked at just one type of behavior. But if I want to look at, say, let's switch gears and look at job satisfaction and its impact on employees, I might not look at just how do people perform one task. I will look at multiple tasks. I will look at multiple different types of performance in the organization. And so we do find that when we look at multiple different kinds of behaviors or outcomes, the impact of attitudes on behaviors is a little bit stronger. Once again, this is because over multiple opportunities, over multiple different situations, then we might actually see how attitudes impact behaviors as opposed to a one-shot scenario where if a person doesn't do something, then that really limits the extent to which we can see the attitude impacting the behavior or In other words, when you're only looking at one type of behavior or one case, one opportunity to perform that behavior, as I noted before, there's so many other things that can influence the behavior in that moment. So we need to look at multiple different types of behaviors or multiple times so we can better assess overall and in general how much the attitude is impacting the behavior. We also have found in subsequent research that when we predict behaviors based on attitudes toward the behavior, in other words, intentions, or rather, I have a positive feeling about treating customers poorly, or I have a negative attitude toward treating customers poorly. That is more likely to impact my actual behaviors, my treating customers poorly, than any other attitude I could have. So your evaluation of your attitude, or rather your attitude toward a behavior, is more likely to predict that behavior than some other behavior, or sorry, other attitude. So what about when our attitudes and behaviors are inconsistent, right? What about these cases when our attitudes don't impact our behaviors? For example, in the study that looked at the treatment that Chinese individuals received in hospitality situations, what happens when people say racist attitudes or self-reported racist attitudes don't actually lead to racist behaviors? Well, what happens is cognitive dissonance emerges. So, this is basically what happens when either your attitudes and your behaviors are inconsistent, or your attitudes are inconsistent with themselves. So, let's think of a hospitality worker. A hospitality worker who has inconsistent or incompatible attitudes may, for example, actually harbor Asian sentiment, while also, or have an anti-Asian attitude, while also having a negative attitude, or rather a positive attitude, excuse me, toward providing good customer service. So when this person encounters an Asian couple, they find that those attitudes are now incompatible in terms of what it means for their behavior. Or if they just find themselves thinking about the hypothetical of, well, what if an Asian couple comes in? I have this positive attitude toward providing good customer service, but a negative attitude toward Asian individuals. What am I going to do? Or what does that say about me as a hospitality representative? You could also have incompatible attitudes and behaviors. So you could have attitudes, for example, let's go back to the example of the anti-Asian sentiment and the anti-Asian attitude. If you have a negative attitude toward Asian individuals, but you provide good hospitality toward them when they show up to your hotel or your restaurant, you may say, I have this negative attitude toward them, but my behavior suggests that maybe not. And so people experience dissonance when you see this incompatibility or inconsistency between your attitudes, or your attitudes and behaviors. You want to reduce that dissonance. You don't want to appear inconsistent. You want to appear consistent and authentic. And so people often try to then reduce the dissonance. They either change their behavior. So someone may start to say, well, if I have this negative attitude towards a certain group of people, then I'm going to act in a way that's consistent with it. Or they change the attitude. They say, well, I guess I don't have a negative attitude toward this particular group. Or they rationalize it. So they say, you know what? I still have this negative attitude towards that group of people, but because I was at work, there was no way I was going to act on it. So they explain it away. So those are 3 ways that we can deal with the dissonance between our attitudes and our behaviors. There are also certain situations akin to what we experience in the workplace that might lead us to experience less dissonance. One case is where we get rewards. So if someone says, I'll give you $1 million to say you like the Cowboys, even if you don't like the Cowboys, you'll say it because that's a pretty compelling reward. And in that way, you may not experience a ton of dissonance because the reward was so strong that you can say to yourself, I did it for the reward. I'm still a consistent person. I just did it for the reward. Another way in which we may experience less dissonance or less of a desire to reduce it is when the attitude and or the behavior aren't that important. So if I say, if someone says, hey, you have to say that you like the Cowboys, if I don't actually care about football all that much, the dissonance between me saying I like the Cowboys and wearing a Patriots jersey won't really bother me because football doesn't impact me, or I don't really care about it. Or at work, if you don't actually care about your work, the inconsistency between, say, your job satisfaction and your actual performance. So if you have high job satisfaction but low performance, you may say, well, it doesn't really matter to me. So if pointing out that I'm not performing well, but I say I'm satisfied, I don't really care. Another example of when we might not experience as much desire to reduce our dissonance, or we just won't experience dissonance in the first place, is when there's strong social influence, going back to the theory of planned behavior. So if there's a strong social influence that I should say something or report a certain attitude or engage in a certain behavior, then I might not experience as much dissonance when either my attitudes don't align or my attitudes and my behaviors don't align. So if I were in Texas and saying, I like the Cowboys, even though maybe I don't like the Cowboys, or I have a positive attitude toward the Patriots, or I say I like the Cowboys, but I never watch any of their games, I might say, look, the social pressure is too much here. I have to say I like the Cowboys. So I don't actually experience that much dissonance, basically because I'm able to explain it away due to these factors. So before we start talking about specific kinds of job attitudes, I do want to note that there are certain situations under which we can better predict behaviors from attitudes. The reason this is important to know is when you are working in an organization and you do, say, an employee attitude survey, or you reach out to your employees and you do one of those job satisfaction surveys, you may want to understand, when is your employee's job satisfaction actually going to lead to better performance? When is their organizational commitment actually going to lead to more citizenship behaviors? So we can best predict behaviors when the attitude is readily accessible. So when the person can generate that attitude. By that, what I mean is, if I were to ask you, how do you feel about your work? Are you able to readily say, I feel this way about my work? Or does it take you a while to figure out? The ease with which you can say how you feel about something in terms of your attitude, the more likely it is to influence your behavior. Once again, we've talked about importance, so I won't mention that, other than to say if an attitude is important to someone, so their job satisfaction is important to them, it's more likely to influence their behaviors at work. When there's correspondence between the behaviors and attitudes, that's what we talked about, where, for example, it's your attitude toward a behavior. So in this case, say your attitude toward performing the tasks for your job, that's more likely to influence you doing your job than your job satisfaction. When there are strong social pressures, we will also be better able to predict behaviors from attitudes. When someone has direct experience with the thing, so if you were to ask someone about their attitude toward their supervisor, but they've never actually really interacted with their supervisor, we probably won't actually be able to strongly predict the behavior from their attitude toward the supervisor. And related to the theory of planned behavior, if people have high perceptions of self-efficacy, so they believe that they are capable of doing things, they are far more likely to engage in the behavior. And that goes back to the theory of planned behavior, which we talked about earlier.